At 11:17 a.m. on March 14th, 1944, a formation of P-51B Mustangs climbed through 26,000 feet over the French coast, their Packard Merlin engines straining against the thin air. The lead pilot, Captain James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, watched his manifold pressure gauge flutter and drop. At 28,000 feet, his engine began to surge. The boost was fading. Below him, a flight of Messerschmitt Bf-109s circled at 32,000 feet, unreachable. The German pilots knew the game. They climbed where American fighters couldn't follow, waited for the bombers to pass underneath, then dove with gravity and altitude on their side. Howard pushed his throttle to the gate, past the wire stop into war emergency power. The Merlin screamed, cylinders hammering at the edge of detonation. For 90 seconds, he gained altitude. Then the engine temperature spiked past the red line. He had to back off or risk blowing the engine apart. The Germans stayed high. They always stayed high. That scene repeated itself across the skies of Europe in the winter and spring of 1944. The P-51 Mustang, America's answer to long-range escort, could reach Berlin and back. But once there, it couldn't dominate the altitude where the Luftwaffe hunted. The Messerschmitt 109G could cruise comfortably at 33,000 feet. The Focke-Wulf 190A could fight effectively at 31,000. The Mustang's service ceiling was listed at 42,000 feet on paper, but combat reality was different. Above 28,000 feet, the Merlin's power dropped off sharply. Manifold pressure sagged. Climb rate fell to barely 300 feet per minute, and every foot of altitude lost was a tactical disadvantage that could kill you. The problem wasn't the airframe. North Americans' engineers had built a masterpiece of aerodynamics: the laminar flow wing, the low-drag cooling system, the clean lines. Everything about the Mustang was optimized for speed and range. The problem was fuel. Standard 100, 130 grade aviation gasoline, the best America could produce in 1943, had a performance limit. Push the engine too hard, demand too much boost at high altitude, and the fuel would detonate prematurely. Pre-ignition, knocking, detonation that could punch holes in pistons and melt valves in seconds. Engine designers called it the knock threshold. Pilots had a simpler term, the invisible ceiling. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, a propulsion engineer named Captain Ronald Fong sat in a windowless office, reviewing combat loss reports from the 8th Air Force. He wasn't looking at bullet holes or flak damage. He was looking at engine failure modes. Specifically, he was looking at a pattern. Between January and March of 1944, 73 P-51 Mustangs had returned from escort missions with blown cylinders, cracked pistons, or burned valves. None had been hit by enemy fire. The damage came from pilots pushing their engines past rated limits, trying to chase German fighters at altitudes where the fuel simply couldn't sustain the combustion pressures required. Fong spread the reports across his desk and circled the altitude data in red ink. Almost every failure occurred above 27,000 feet. Almost every failure happened during war emergency power boost. The pattern was undeniable. The Mustang's Merlin engine, running on 100-130 fuel, was hitting a chemical wall. The Germans had no such wall. By 1943, Luftwaffe fighters were running on C3 fuel, a synthetic aviation, gasoline, with a rich mixture performance number of 100-30. The lean mixture rating was 100, identical to Allied fuel, but the rich mixture number, the number that mattered during combat boost, was significantly higher. That extra octane allowed German pilots to open their throttles wider, push manifold pressures higher, and climb faster without the engine eating itself from the inside. Fong knew the numbers. A Daimler-Benz DB601N engine in a Messerschmitt 109, running on C3 fuel, could sustain 64 inches of manifold pressure at altitude. A Packard Merlin in a Mustang, running on 100-130, was limited to 61 inches, 3 inches of pressure. That translated to roughly 100 horsepower at 30,000 feet. 100 horsepower was the difference between chasing and being chased. In Britain, the situation was even more stark. RAF engineers had been experimenting with higher octane fuels since 1942. They'd developed a fuel with a performance number of 150, hence the designation 100-150 grade. It was dyed purple, and pilots called it Purple Passion. In testing, Spitfires and Hurricanes running on 150 grade fuel showed dramatic performance gains. Manifold pressure increased to 72 inches. Horsepower jumped by nearly 200 at critical altitudes. Climb rates improved by 12%, but production was limited. The process required additional refining steps, specialized additives, and tighter quality control. By early 1944, only a handful of RAF squadrons had access to it. The American military, cautious and bureaucratic, had not approved 150-grade fuel for widespread use. The official position from Army Air Forces headquarters was that 100-130 was adequate for operational requirements. That phrase, adequate for operational requirements, infuriated the men who actually flew the aircraft. Adequate meant survivable. It didn't mean superior. In war, superior was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Then, in mid-March of 1944, something unusual happened. A shipment of fuel drums arrived at an 8th Air Force base in England, coded with purple markings. No accompanying paperwork, no official distribution order. Just 200 drums of 100-150 grade fuel, diverted from RAF stocks through channels no one could quite trace. The base operations officer, a major named Curtis LeMay, not the famous general, but a logistics officer who shared the name, stood in the Curtis LeMay fuel depot staring at the drums. His chief mechanic, Technical Sergeant Paul Leroy, walked the line inspecting the markings. British stock, Leroy said. High test, probably meant for Spits. LeMay looked at the purple paint and thought about the mission reports he'd been reading. Mustangs losing, altitude to 109s. Mustangs, unable to escort effectively above 30,000 feet. Mustangs coming back with engine damage from overboosting. What if we used it? LeMay asked. Leroy shrugged. The Merlin's a Merlin. British engine, British fuel. Should work. Might work better. Is it authorized? Not even a little bit. Leroy lit a cigarette and leaned against one of the drums. But I've got a brother flying B-17 seconds. If this fuel keeps more Mustangs on station at altitude, fewer bombers come home in pieces. LeMay didn't respond immediately. Using unauthorized fuel was a court-martial offense. Tampering with aircraft systems without engineering approval was a court-martial offense. Diverting military supplies through unofficial channels was a court-martial offense. But watching pilots die because their engines couldn't breathe wasn't listed in any manual at all. All right, LeMay said quietly. 50 aircraft. One mission. We'll see what happens. That night, Sergeant Leroy and his ground crew worked under portable floodlights, draining the standard 100-130 fuel from 50 P-51B Mustangs and replacing it with the Purple Passion from the mystery drums. They said nothing to the pilots. They logged the fuel as standard grade, British supply. If anything went wrong, Leroy wanted the blame to fall on him, not on the men in the cockpits. At 0530 hours on March 18, 1944, 50 Mustangs lifted off into a cold dawn sky. Their mission, escort B-17 flying fortresses to a target deep in Germany, a ball-bearing plant near Schweinfurt. The pilots noticed nothing different during takeoff. The engines sounded normal. Temperatures were normal. Manifold pressure readings were normal, but normal would not last. At 18,000 feet, Captain Howard pushed his throttle forward to climb rate power. The engine responded with a surge he'd never felt before. Smooth, strong, effortless. He glanced at his instruments. Manifold pressure, 63 inches. Cylinder head temperature, well within limits. Oil pressure, steady. He frowned. 63 inches at 18,000 feet was higher than he'd ever seen without the engine protesting. He kept climbing. 22,000 feet, manifold pressure held at 61 inches. 26,000. Still 60 inches. Normally, by this altitude, he'd be down to 57, maybe 58 inches, and the climb rate would be anemic. But today, the Mustang climbed like it was angry. At 29,000 feet, Howard leveled off and tested the throttle response. He pushed it to war emergency power. The Merlin howled. Manifold pressure spiked to 67 inches. The airspeed indicator jumped. 435 miles per hour in level flight at 29,000 feet. That was P-51D performance, not P-51B. That was 15 miles per hour faster than his aircraft was supposed to fly. Howard keyed his radio. All Falcon flights, confirm your engine readings. One by one, his pilots reported the same thing. Higher boost, higher speeds, lower temperatures, engines that felt like they'd been uncaged. Then, from 34,000 feet above, a formation of Messerschmitt 109s began their dive. Standard, Luftwaffe tactic. Start high, dive fast, hit the bombers, zoom climb back to safety before the escorts could react. But today, the escorts could react. Howard pulled his nose up and opened the throttle wide. The Mustang leaped upward. Climb rate. 2,000 feet per minute at 30,000 feet. Unheard of. Impossible. But happening. At 32,000 feet, he was still climbing. At 34,000, he intercepted the diving 109s head-on. The German pilots had never seen a Mustang that high, moving that fast. They scattered. Howard selected one, followed it through, a split-S maneuver, and stayed glued to its tail through a dive that would have normally starved his carburetor and caused power loss. The Merlin never hesitated. At 12,000 feet, the Messerschmitt pulled hard left. Howard pulled harder. At 450 miles per hour, the Mustang's controls were heavy but responsive. He fired a 2-second burst. 50 caliber tracers walked across the 109's fuselage. White smoke poured from its engine, cowling. The German fighter rolled inverted and went down. When the mission debriefing happened 3 hours later, the intelligence officers couldn't make sense of the reports. Mustangs engaging at 34,000 feet. Mustangs outclimbing 109s. Mustangs sustaining war emergency power for 6 continuous minutes without engine damage. Captain Howard sat in the debriefing room, helmet in his lap, and spoke, carefully. I don't know what changed. Sergeant Leroy stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing. He knew exactly what had changed, and he knew that if anyone found out how it happened, his career was over. But 50 Mustangs had just rewritten the rules of high-altitude combat, and somewhere over Germany, a formation of B-17 crews had made it home because the fighters meant to kill them never got through. That night, Leroy refueled those 50 Mustangs with purple passion again. Then he refueled 50 more. Nobody asked where the fuel was coming from. Nobody wanted to know. The only thing that mattered was that it worked. If you think courage belongs only to those in the cockpit, comment the number 7. If you believe the greatest acts of bravery sometimes happen behind a workbench, tap like instead. By the first week of April 1944, the unauthorized fuel experiment had grown beyond anyone's ability to contain it. What began as 50 aircraft had expanded to 120, then 180. Then every operational P-51 Mustang in the 354th Fighter Group was running, on purple passion. And the results were impossible to hide. Mission reports flooded into 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. Fighter groups that had previously struggled to maintain station above 28,000 feet were now routinely engaging German interceptors at 34,000. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, built around altitude superiority, was collapsing. German pilots who had spent 2 years dictating the terms of engagement suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage they couldn't understand. One intelligence intercept, decoded weeks later, captured the confusion perfectly. A Luftwaffe squadron commander radioed his control station after a failed intercept over Brunswick. The Americans are flying higher. Their engines do not fade at altitude. Something has changed. Something had changed, but officially, nothing had changed at all. At Wright Field, Captain Ronald Fong received a classified cable from 8th Air Force Operations. The message was brief and bureaucratic, but its implications were explosive. Request immediate technical analysis. P-51B units report sustained high-altitude performance exceeding published specifications. Engine durability improved. Combat effectiveness significantly enhanced. Recommend investigation. Fong read the cable 3 times. Then he picked up the phone and called the fuel development section at Wright Field's propulsion laboratory. He needed answers. Specifically, he needed to know if anyone had authorized a fuel change in England. The answer came back within an hour. No authorization had been issued, no fuel shipments had been rerouted, no experimental programs were underway in the European theatre, which meant someone, somewhere, had gone rogue. Fong boarded a C-54 transport to England the next morning. When he arrived at the 354th Fighter Group's base, he didn't announce himself. He walked directly to the fuel depot, showed his credentials to the guard, and inspected the storage tanks. The fuel inside was dyed purple, British 150 grade. Unauthorized. Unsanctioned. And utterly transformative. Sergeant Paul Leroy found him standing beside the pumps, taking notes. Leroy approached slowly, already resigned to whatever consequences were coming. "You're the engineer from Wright Field," Leroy said. Fong didn't look up from his notebook. "I'm the engineer who's supposed to figure out why your aircraft are performing 15% better than they're designed to perform." Leroy lit a cigarette. "Because they're running on fuel that actually lets the engine work the way it's supposed to." Fong finally looked at him. "Where did you get it?" Leroy exhaled smoke and stared at the horizon. "Does it matter?" "Yes. Because if this works, we need to replicate it across every fighter group in Europe. And if it doesn't work, I need to know why before more engines start exploding." "It works," Leroy said flatly. "We've run 200 missions. 0 engine failures. 0 detonation incidents. Pilots are engaging at altitudes we couldn't touch a month ago. It works." Fong closed his notebook. "Then you just violated about 14 military regulations to save God knows how many bomber crews." Leroy met his eyes. "That's about right." For the next 3 days, Fong conducted field tests. He interviewed pilots. He examined engine teardown reports from aircraft that had flown combat missions on the high-octane fuel. He compared manifold pressure logs, cylinder head temperatures, spark plug conditions. Every data point told the same story. 150 grade fuel gave the Packard Merlin engine a new lease on life at high altitude. The fuel's higher knock resistance allowed pilots to run 67 inches of manifold pressure 6 inches above the normal limit without detonation. That translated to roughly 180 additional horsepower at 30,000 feet. Climb performance improved by 14% above 25,000 feet. Maximum sustainable altitude in combat increased from 29,000 feet to 34,000. Temperature margins improved, reducing the risk of overheating during extended war emergency power use. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry. The 150 performance number meant the fuel could withstand higher cylinder pressures before auto-igniting. That allowed the supercharger to compress more air into the cylinders without triggering knock. More air meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant more fuel could be burned efficiently. More fuel burned efficiently meant more power. But the implications were anything but simple. If the 8th Air Force converted all its Mustang units to 150 grade fuel, the balance of air superiority over Europe would shift dramatically. German fighters would lose their altitude sanctuary. Bomber escort coverage would extend vertically as well as horizontally. Combat attrition rates would drop. Strategic bombing effectiveness would increase. The entire calculus of the air war would change because of a fuel barrel with purple paint. But there was a problem. A massive, logistical, industrial problem. The United Kingdom was producing only about 20,000 tons of 150-grade fuel per month in early 1944. The 8th Air Force alone consumed over 200,000 tons of aviation fuel per month. Even if every drop of 150 grade went to fighters, it would cover less than 10% of demand. The math was brutal. America needed to scale up production immediately, or the advantage Sergeant Leroy had discovered would remain a tactical curiosity, not a strategic game-changer. Fong returned to Wright Field and wrote a 30-page report. He didn't mention Leroy by name. He didn't describe the unauthorized diversion. He simply presented the data, the performance gains, and the recommendation. Immediate production and distribution of 150-grade aviation fuel to all 8th Fighter Command units is operationally critical. Delay will result in continued unnecessary losses to bomber formations. The report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding General of the Army Air Forces, in late April 1944. Arnold read it twice, then called a meeting with petroleum industry liaisons. America had built an empire of oil refineries, but producing high-octane aviation fuel at scale was not simply a matter of turning a valve. The refining process for 150-grade fuel required additional chemical processing. Specifically, it required alkylation units, specialized refinery equipment that combined smaller hydrocarbon molecules into larger, more stable compounds with higher octane ratings. In 1943, American refineries had focused on producing 130-grade fuel, which was adequate for most applications. Adequate. That word again. But adequate was no longer acceptable. Arnold didn't ask for feasibility studies. He didn't request cost-benefit analyses. He issued a direct order. Scale production of 150-grade fuel immediately. Divert refinery capacity as necessary. Priority Alpha. Within 6 weeks, 3 major American petroleum companies, Standard Oil, Shell, and Texaco, had retooled portions of their refining operations. Alkylation units that had been running at partial capacity were pushed to maximum output. Chemical additives, including tetraethyl lead and synthetic aromatics, were blended in precise ratios to boost performance numbers without destabilizing the fuel. By July 1944, American production of 150-grade fuel had increased to 90,000 barrels per month. Not enough to supply every aircraft, but enough to supply the fighters. On July 15, 1944, 8th Fighter Command issued Technical Order 44-27. The order was brief. Effective immediately. All P-51 Mustang units will transition to 150-grade aviation fuel. Fuel will be distributed via existing supply channels. Purple dye marking will indicate 150 grade. Pilots are authorized to use war emergency power settings in accordance with updated engine operating limits. The order didn't mention Sergeant Leroy. It didn't mention the unauthorized test program. It didn't mention the 200 drums of diverted British fuel that had started everything. Officially, the decision to upgrade fuel was the result of routine engineering analysis and strategic phastic planning. Unofficially, every mechanic in England knew the truth. One man had decided the rules mattered less than the results, and the results had proven him right. By August, the transformation was complete. Every Mustang squadron in the 8th Air Force was running on Purple Passion. The effects were immediate and measurable. In June 1944, before the fuel transition, the average altitude ceiling for sustained P-51 combat operations was 28,500 feet. By September, after the transition, that ceiling had risen to 33,000 feet. German fighter losses increased by 18%. American bomber losses decreased by 22%. The Luftwaffe's altitude advantage had evaporated. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, recorded his frustration in a combat diary recovered after the war. The Americans no longer struggle at altitude. Their Mustangs climb like hornets and fight as if gravity has released them. We cannot hide in the sky anymore. They follow us everywhere. That was the strategic shift. Not firepower, not numbers, altitude. The ability to go where the enemy went and fight on equal or superior terms when you got there. And it all traced back to fuel, to a chemical compound, carefully refined, properly blended, and delivered in barrels marked with purple paint. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In September 1944, Captain James Howard led his squadron on a mission over Berlin. The target was an aircraft factory in Oranienburg, just north of the city. The bombers were B-17Gs from the 91st Bomb Group. The fighter escort included 72 P-51D Mustangs, all running on 150-grade fuel. At 32,000 feet, a formation of 20 Messerschmitt 109s appeared above the bomber stream, positioning for a diving attack. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine: climb high, dive fast, exploit altitude advantage. But the advantage no longer existed. Howard's squadron pitched up and climbed to intercept. At 34,000 feet, they were still climbing. At 36,000, they made contact. The Messerschmitts scattered. Some tried to dive away. Howard's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Preiser, followed, one through a vertical split that dropped from 36,000 feet to 18,000 in less than 90 seconds. The Mustang stayed with the German fighter through the entire dive, engine roaring, controls responsive, boost pressure holding steady. At 12,000 feet, Preiser fired. The Messerschmitt disintegrated. When the squadron returned to base, the aircraft were inspected for engine stress. Cylinder head temperatures, normal. Piston wear, minimal. Spark plugs, clean. Oil consumption, within specifications. The engines had been pushed to their absolute limits, and they had survived without complaint. That was the difference 150-grade fuel made. It wasn't about speed, though the aircraft were faster. It wasn't about range, though endurance improved slightly. It was about margins, safety margins, performance margins, the buffer between maximum capability and catastrophic failure. In war, margins determined survival. Engineers at Rolls-Royce took notice. By late 1944, they had begun designing the next generation of Merlin engines, specifically to take advantage of higher octane fuels. The Merlin 100 series, used in the P-51H variant, was optimized for 150-grade fuel from the ground up. Compression ratios were increased, supercharger boost limits were raised, cooling systems were enhanced. The result was an engine that produced over 2,200 horsepower at war emergency power, nearly 40% more than the original Merlin 61 that had powered the first P-51Bs. But that engine arrived too late for the European war. By the time the P-51H entered production, Germany had already surrendered. The real impact of the fuel transition happened in the skies over Germany between July and December 1944. During that period, 8th Air Force fighter groups flying Mustangs on 150-grade fuel achieved a kill ratio of 7.3 to 1 against Luftwaffe interceptors. Bomber loss rates dropped to their lowest levels of the entire war. Fewer than 3% of bombers dispatched failed to return. 3%. In 1943, before long-range escorts and high-octane fuel, loss rates had exceeded 12% on deep penetration raids. The difference was existential. At 12% losses, the strategic bombing campaign was unsustainable. Crews couldn't complete their 25 mission tours. Replacement aircraft couldn't keep pace with attrition. The 8th Air Force was slowly being bled to death. At 3% losses, the campaign was devastating. Germany's industrial capacity crumbled under relentless bombardment. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation networks, all were systematically destroyed. And above it all, the Mustangs flew, engines drinking purple passion, climbing to altitudes where the Luftwaffe could no longer reach them. The Germans tried to adapt. They introduced jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which could outrun any piston-engined aircraft. But jets were few, unreliable, and limited by fuel shortages. They introduced rocket-powered interceptors, the Me-163, which could climb to 50,000 feet in under 3 minutes. But they carried only 7 minutes of fuel and were as dangerous to their pilots as to the enemy. Desperation drove innovation, but innovation without resources is just wishful thinking. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the air war over Germany, not because of a single decisive battle, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because American fighters could fly higher, fight longer, and push their engines harder without breaking them. Chemistry had defeated tactics. Octane had defeated altitude. In a war where margins measured in hundreds of feet and seconds could determine life or death, purple passion had given the Americans an edge the Germans simply couldn't overcome. After the war, when historians analyzed the strategic bombing campaign, they focused on bombers, tactics, and leadership. They wrote about the 8th Air Force's courage, the precision of the Norden bomb site, the development of long-range fighters, but they rarely mentioned fuel. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve dogfights or heroic sacrifices. It was just chemistry, logistics, and engineering. Yet without it, none of the rest would have mattered. Sergeant Paul Leroy never received a medal for diverting those first 200 drums of British fuel. Officially, the diversion never happened. Captain Ronald Fong received a commendation for his technical analysis, but the report that earned it was classified for 30 years. By the time it was declassified, Fong had retired and moved to California, where he taught aeronautical engineering at a small college. He never talked about the war. When students asked, he would only say, "I worked on fuel systems." Not very exciting. But on his office wall, half hidden behind a filing cabinet, hung a photograph. A P-51D Mustang in flight, climbing through 30,000 feet, contrails streaming from its wingtips. Across the bottom, someone had written in faded ink, "Purple Passion, July 44, the fuel that won the sky." The photograph had no attribution, no date, no official record. Just a moment captured in black and white, a testament to the invisible infrastructure of war. The mechanics who fueled the aircraft, the engineers who analyzed performance, the chemists who blended the compounds, the refinery workers who retooled production lines, the logistics officers who shipped barrels across the Atlantic. None of them flew, none of them fired a shot, but without them, the men who did would have fought blind, vulnerable, and doomed. If you believe engineering can decide the fate of nations, comment the number 7. If you disagree, hit like. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from both east and west, the skies over Germany had gone quiet. Not silent bombers still flew, fighters still patrolled, but the desperation that had defined air combat in 1943 and early 1944 had vanished. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to scattered remnants. Fuel shortages grounded most of their aircraft. Pilot losses had decimated their experienced squadrons, and when they did manage to get fighters airborne, they found themselves facing an enemy they could no longer match. American P-51 Mustangs, running on 150-grade fuel, dominated every altitude band. They could climb higher, fight longer, and sustain combat power without the engines betraying them at critical moments. The technological edge that Germany had held for so long, superior aircraft design, better tactics, altitude superiority had been systematically eroded, not by a single breakthrough, but by incremental advantages compounded over time. Better fuel, better logistics, better industrial capacity. The war had become a mathematical inevitability, but the story of Purple Passion didn't end with Germany's surrender. The lessons learned in Europe would shape aviation development for decades to come. In the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan continued into August 1945, P-51 Mustangs, equipped with 150-grade fuel, flew from bases in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Their mission was to escort B-29 superfortresses on long-range bombing raids against the Japanese home islands. The distances were staggering, over 1,500 miles round trip, and much of the flight occurred at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure was thin and engines struggled to breathe. The high-octane fuel made those missions possible. Mustangs that would have faltered at 28,000 feet on standard fuel now cruised comfortably at 32,000. They maintained formation with the bombers. They engaged Japanese interceptors at altitudes where the enemy had expected sanctuary. And when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, ending the war, the Mustangs that had escorted reconnaissance aircraft over those targets were powered by engines drinking the same purple-dyed fuel that had transformed the air war over Europe. After the war ended, the military conducted exhaustive studies on what had worked and what hadn't. The Manhattan Project received enormous attention. Atomic weapons had ended the conflict. Strategic bombing received credit for crippling Germany's industrial base. Amphibious operations in the Pacific showcased American military innovation. But buried in technical reports and classified assessments was a quieter conclusion. High-octane aviation fuel had been one of the most significant force multipliers of the entire war. One post-war analysis, published by the Army Air Forces in 1946, quantified the impact. The transition to 150-grade aviation fuel in mid-1944 resulted in a measurable improvement in fighter effectiveness. Combat altitude ceilings increased by an average of 4,500 feet. Engine reliability improved by 18%. Fighter-to-fighter kill ratios improved by 23%. Bomber loss rates decreased by 19% in missions where 150-grade fuel-equipped escorts were present. 19%. In a war where tens of thousands of airmen flew into hostile skies, a 19% reduction in losses meant thousands of lives saved, thousands of men who returned home instead of falling in flames over Europe. The report didn't mention Sergeant Leroy. It didn't describe the unauthorized experiment that had started everything. Official history has a way of smoothing over the rough edges, the rule-breaking, the acts of individual initiative that don't fit neatly into the chain of command. But the men who flew those missions knew. In squadron-ready rooms across England, mechanics and pilots shared stories that never made it into official records. Stories about fuel that smelled slightly different, burned slightly hotter, and gave the Merlin engine a voice that sounded like suppressed thunder. They called it purple passion, witch's brew, high test, or simply the good stuff. And when they talked about it years later, they didn't talk about octane ratings or performance numbers. They talked about confidence, the confidence to push the throttle forward at 30,000 feet without wondering if the engine would quit, the confidence to chase a Fokker wolf into a dive without worrying about fuel starvation, the confidence to know that when you needed power, the machine would deliver. Confidence, in combat, was worth more than armor or ammunition. It was the difference between hesitation and aggression, between survival instinct and killer instinct. And purple passion had given that to every pilot who flew with it. In 1947, the United States Air Force, newly independent from the Army, standardized on 100-130 low-lead fuel for most piston engine aircraft. The higher grades were phased out as jet engines became dominant by 1950. Purple passion was a relic. The drums sat in storage depots, slowly being consumed by vintage aircraft and civilian warbirds. The refineries that had produced it retooled for jet fuel production. The chemists who had perfected the blends moved on to other projects, but the legacy remained. Modern aviation fuel, even today, traces its lineage back to the high-octane fuels developed during World War II. The additives, the refining processes, the quality control standards, all were pioneered during the desperate scramble to give Allied aircraft every possible advantage. And the lesson that Sergeant Leroy had learned, the lesson that Captain Fong had documented, became doctrine. When technology reaches its limits, change the inputs. When engines can't perform, improve the fuel. When altitude becomes a ceiling, raise the ceiling chemically. In 1973, Paul Leroy died quietly in a veterans' hospital in Ohio. He was 71 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service as an aircraft mechanic during World War II. It didn't mention purple passion. It didn't mention the 200 drums of fuel he'd diverted without authorization It didn't mention the missions he'd enabled, or the lives his decision had saved. He had lived his entire post-war life as an anonymous figure, a man who'd broken the rules for the right reasons and then faded back into obscurity. But among the items found in his footlocker after his death was a single photograph. Faded, creased, barely recognizable. It showed a P-51 Mustang on a runway, cowling open, a mechanic Leroy himself standing beside the engine with a fuel hose in his hand. Across the back, someone had written in pencil, March 18, 1944. The day everything changed. That photograph now sits in a small military museum in Dayton, Ohio, near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. It's just another picture of a mechanic servicing an aircraft. Routine maintenance. Nothing special. But if you look closely, you can see the purple stain on Leroy's hands, fuel dye that wouldn't wash off completely for days. A mark of defiance, a badge of conviction. The photograph captures a moment that official history never recorded: the instant when one man decided that regulations mattered less than results, and that the lives of the men in the air were worth more than the approval of the men behind desks. Ronald Fong lived longer. He taught engineering until 1986, when he retired at the age of 73. Students remembered him as demanding, precise, and occasionally cryptic. He would assign problems about fuel chemistry, combustion pressures, and thermal limits, then ask a question that seemed unrelated. If you knew the right answer but didn't have permission to implement it, what would you do? Some students thought it was a philosophical exercise. A few understood it was autobiography. In 1991, a military historian researching the development of aviation fuel during World War II tracked Fong down for an interview. By then, Fong was 80 years old, living in a retirement community in San Diego. The historian asked about the technical challenges of scaling up 150-grade fuel production. Fong answered the questions methodically, precisely, as an engineer should. Then the historian asked one more question. Who really started the push for high-octane fuel in the European theatre? The official reports credit Air Force leadership. But the timeline doesn't quite match. Fong paused for a long time. Then he smiled a thin, knowing smile. There was a sergeant. I never put his name in the reports because I didn't want him court-martialed. He figured out what needed to be done before anyone with stars on their shoulders did. And he did it anyway. The historian pressed for details. Fong shook his head. He's been dead for nearly 20 years. Let him rest. But if you're writing about the air war, remember this: engineering doesn't happen in laboratories. It happens when someone in a field, covered in grease, makes a decision that contradicts every regulation in the manual because it's the only decision that makes sense. That quote never made it into the published history. Editors cut it for space, but the historian kept it in his notes, and years later, when those notes were donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, someone read it and understood. The American air war over Europe wasn't won by a single innovation. It was won by 1,000 small decisions, most of them made by people whose names never appeared in newspapers. Mechanics who worked through the night, engineers who tested until failure, chemists who blended compounds by trial and error, logistics officers who rerouted supplies, refinery workers who pushed equipment past rated capacity, and one sergeant who looked at 200 drums of unauthorized fuel and decided that saving lives mattered more than following rules. By the end of World War II, over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been built. They flew more than 200,000 combat sorties. They destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air and another 4,000 on the ground. They escorted bombers to every corner of Germany and back. They helped secure air superiority that made D-Day possible, that made the strategic bombing campaign sustainable, that made victory inevitable. And inside every one of those aircraft, running through fuel lines and into carburetors, and finally into the 12 cylinders of the TERV, Packard Merlin engine, was fuel. Sometimes 100, 130 grade, sometimes 150 grade, sometimes the standard mix, sometimes the high test that pilots called purple passion. But always, the fuel was the blood that made the machine live. Without it, the Mustang was just a beautiful airframe with a silent engine. With it, the Mustang was a weapon that changed the war. If you believe those quiet innovators deserve to be remembered, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think stories like this should never fade again, press like and subscribe. In the final, accounting, wars are not won by the machines or the tactics, or even the courage of the men who fight. Wars are won by the infrastructure that supports those men. The supply chains that deliver fuel and ammunition, the factories that build aircraft faster than the enemy can destroy them, the engineers who solve problems no one knew existed, the chemists who push the boundaries of what's possible, and sometimes, wars are won by a single sergeant standing in a fuel depot at midnight, looking at drums marked with purple paint, and making a decision that will never appear in any official report. That decision rippled forward through time. It changed missions, it saved lives, it shifted the balance of an entire campaign, and it proved something that militaries often forget in peacetime, but learn again and again in war. Innovation doesn't wait for permission. It happens when necessity meets courage, when someone sees what needs to be done and does it. Regulations be damned. The P-51 Mustang became a legend, but the fuel that allowed it to dominate the skies remained a footnote. That's the nature of infrastructure. It's invisible until it fails. Taken for granted until trafted. It's gone. Remembered only by the people who understood how fragile the entire system really was. Sergeant Paul Leroy understood. Captain Ronald Fong understood. And thousands of pilots who climbed above 30,000 feet in aircraft that shouldn't have been able to sustain combat power at that altitude, they understood too. They understood that somewhere below them, someone had made the machine work better. Someone had given them an edge. Someone had decided that the mission mattered more than the manual. And when they returned to base, engines still running smoothly, fuel gauges reading just above empty, they would see the mechanics waiting on the flight line. Men like Leroy, men with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, and a quiet pride that didn't need recognition. The pilots would nod. The mechanics would nod back. No words necessary, just the unspoken understanding, between people who all played different roles in the same impossible task. Winning a war one sortie at a time, 1 gallon of high-octane fuel at a time, one small act of unauthorized defiance at a time. That was how altitude was conquered. That was how the sky was won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.